Okay, so it's time to put the heads on. Got the block surface cleaned. I also have the head surface cleaned and the head gasket, which is the factory style. That's also cleaned and dry. I'm going to be using some gasket sealant. It's a Mopar product. I've had this for a while, this can. Part number 04318035. It's a gasket sealant to spray on all the surfaces. Works pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and spray the block. I'll spray the head surface and both sides of the gasket surface and stick the head on. Then we'll torque everything to spec. Now I did have to cut the top tab off the cylinder head, right up here. That's going to interfere with our intake manifold valley pan, so I just cut off the top. I labeled it so I know which way it's going. Set the head in place and get the bolts. So we're going to put each engine bolt in. I'm going to put a couple drops of oil just on the thread just to lube them up. Drop them in place. And then we'll tighten it per the book. First torque is going to be 50 foot-pounds. The second torque rating will be the final at 70. Okay, so the first torque is going to be at 50 foot-pounds, and we'll follow the tightening sequence here in the book. Round of torque is done, so we'll bump up the torque wrench to the 70 foot-pounds, and we'll repeat the process. Okay, we're going to get the lifters in. I did check all the tolerances as far as the preload goes. and I wound up using shims for the rocker shafts. The rocker shafts ended up getting shimmed 45 thousandths. So I got a 40 thousandths I should say. Got a 30 thousand shim and a 10 thousand shim. Gives me enough lash and movement on the push rods and the lifter assemblies that I'm okay with. So I'm going to continue on and get all these lifters put in so I can get this valley pan on and get the other head on. So we're just going to throw some oil down the bores and put some assembly lube on the bottom or on the face of the lifter and drop them in one by one. All these lifters have been kept in the same place they were when we did the lifter rotation check, so all these lifters are going back in the same bores that they rode on during that inspection, so we don't have any issues with lifter rotation or changing the positions, so they all go back in the same spot. And these do not get pre-primed or pumped up with oil per the directions from the cam. So we just put them in and lube them up and let them go. Okay, so we're going to put the rest of the valve train together on the driver's side. I've got the original push rods from a 1968 Chrysler 383 I bought off eBay. They're in good shape. Only had one that was slightly bent. I was able to straighten it out. I did stick them in my drill press and ran a Scotch-Brite, real fine Scotch-Brite pad over the tip just to polish the end back up because it was a little bit roughed up from sitting around. So the tips are real nice and clean. And what I'm going to do is put some oil down on the lifter tips, or on the lifters themselves where the tips of the push rods go, and we'll get them put in. Actually, I'm going to use this Ultra Slick engine assembly lube on them, just so that this stays there for a while, because it's going to be a little bit before they get fired. Dropped in place. Okay, so for those who don't know, on Chryslers, on the rocker arms, there is a left and right rocker arm. I'll hold them up to you and you can take a look. You can see the dimples inside, they're kind of offset to the center. You'll see all the right and the left, they're kind of offset towards the middle. There's a spacer in between that goes between them. They sit on the rocker shaft that way. So you want to make sure you definitely have them all in order. So what I'm going to do is get some assembly lube on all these rockers, get them mounted onto the shaft, and then put the shaft on the head. Shorter bolts go at the outer edges, in the center, while the two long bolts go to the middle holes. And on this engine I'm also using the shims from Mancini. I got a 30 thousandths and a 10 thousandths shim, so I'll stack those up and put them on each one of the bolts. I'm putting the 10 thousandths shim on top. And get it mounted on the motor. Now there's no real good way of doing this because it's kind of difficult to do it with one person, but we'll try. Just gonna put a little bit of oil on the threads of the bolts. And now we have to get all the bolts and all the push rods and all the rockers onto the valves. Okay, as I'm assembling this, I'm noticing that I didn't put any assembly lube on the tips of the push rods to the rockers, so we're going to back them off and try and squirt a little bit up in there on each rocker. Take your time and go slow. Make sure that they all get into their pockets. Alternate your tightening sequence to pull down evenly. Looks like we're getting them there. Okay, they're all started. So I'll go ahead and I'll just kind of snug them down evenly. And then we'll get the torque wrench and torque it. Torque spec on this is 25 foot-pounds. And just take a look at all the push rods and lifters and the bores. And all the rockers are assembled. Now some of them are lifted up by the cam lobe, as you can see here on this exhaust lifter, but the intake next to it is not. And you can see that it has preload. I don't know if you'll be able to see in there, but you can see on the rocker there's spring tension. I've got tension on it, so it's touching the valve, which is pushing preload on the lifter, but there is enough travel on that lifter to rock that rocker back and forth. And you see on the intake in number 1, and the exhaust is a little bit tight, and I think that's because of the new valves. So we're pretty good that way. I don't want to put any more shim in it, just for fear that we're going to run out of lash on these intakes, because they are pretty free to move. So I'm happy with that. And what we'll do now is we'll get the valley pan installed, cover up the valley. We've got all the lifters already ready to go in the passenger side of the block. So we'll get the valley pan in, the other cylinder head on, and put the rest of the valve train on the passenger side. So I have the valley pan here, it's ready to go. You can see I've bent up the tabs, and this will slide right in on those cylinder heads. And what I'll be able to do is get silicone down underneath the head on each one, and then also backfill each one of these tabs, so it'll have a nice good bonding surface to the tabs, and try and keep most of that engine pressure off of that gasket, as being the only source of retention from blowing out. So we should be good shape. We'll get it siliconed up and put it in. Hopefully this all works out.
Shouldn't you have the other head on first?
No, I can't put both heads on.
It's doing run awfully funny missing a head.
Yeah, fucking hilarious.
I mean, you're just trying to keep the oil splashed down, you know?
Right.
I see you're going to silicone around that too.
Yeah. So it should be pretty solid, you know? Okay, cylinder head. Get this Gex, get on there.
God, they're so heavy.
Fucking heavy. Drop it right into place.
Oh yeah. Look at that, dude.
That's sweet. Put your hand on there a second.
I got it.
Get these bolts going in here. Okay. Won't fall off
Just like in the Chrysler manual. Make sure you increase the compression by like 5 points and then reinstall stock head bolts.
now. It's fine. We'll take it.
Probably just as good as fucking ARP bolts. When's the next time you saw somebody break a freaking head bolt on a Chrysler big block? You know what I mean?
Right?
You're gonna tell me Ray went out and bought ARP studs for all those crazy engine belts?
Probably not.
I'm guessing not when you're buying your rods used from eBay. Well, this engine only had one rod fail. This engine had all the rods fail except for one, so. You're lucky you fucking remember to put those things on there.
Want the shields?
Well, of course you can use them because you're using them their fancy exhaust manifold.
That's right. £54.
Is that one of the oil filters from like that box of random oil filters you bought?
Yeah, that box of big block filters.
Oh, that's right. They were all just Chrysler big block ones, weren't they?
Yeah.
Do you have to do those in steps?
Oh yeah, 50 and then 70.
Oof.
So
Is this one all torqued down?
yeah. Okay, we got the valley pan in. I let it dry overnight. It's siliconed. We have all those little tabs sticking up. I went around each one. I also ran the silicone down this edge inside the head and razor bladed the surface off. So this is nice and clean, and what we'll do is when we get the gaskets on, like on that side, it'll lay right there, but we'll fill this with silicone, run a bead down, set that in, run a bead across, and then we'll put the intake on top of it. So right now what I'm doing is gasket matching it a little bit. Now I already ported out the heads on the intake sides, and you can see how the gasket is nice and lined up with the edges in the centers. It's overlapping just ever so slightly, but I matched it using the factory valley pan. So you can see on the very top of the port there is some material still left. I'm not really overly concerned with it at this point because I did open them up a lot already, and it's not going to be perfect. So what I'm doing is matching it to the intake manifold side. You can see how bad the misaligned the ports on the intakes. So you got a lot of material here on each side, especially on this one. We got a lot to take off here. We're going to open the tops just a little bit. I'm not going all the way to the gasket because the heads don't match that, so I'm not going to go too crazy. So I have the gasket just mounted up. I had the intake on the engine with the gasket, and what I did was, with it installed, I did scribe a line right on the edge when it sits in there, so that gives me a reference point to line up the gasket. You can sort of see it right there, that line. So I could bolt the gasket in place and give me a reference point. Now I already did the driver's side and was able to get a Sharpie marker and basically outline my gasket surface. So you can see the Sharpie, and that's the material that we're going to grind away, and it'll be a lot better than the factory stuff. It's not going to be perfect, and not really looking for ultra perfect here, but it's definitely a whole lot better, so it should work out pretty good. So I'll grind these out and we'll get it back on the motor.